Hi guys, my name is Russell Spatz. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a member of the South Dixie virtual group. It meets 4 o'clock Monday through Friday and on Zoom, and you're welcome to join us. We have a wonderful, wonderful group. I'd love to see you guys there. And I want to congratulate Kristen and her wonderful sponsor. That was great to listen to. And it's congratulations on your 1-year anniversary. I want to welcome Russell, another Russell. Who's on Zoom. What?
Just what we need.
Just what we need, exactly. So I'm an alcoholic, and I haven't found necessary to have a drink since January 25th, thank you. 1981.
Okay.
Right? And I want to thank Sheldon, who accompanies me just about everywhere I go. He helps me out with the Zoom thing and all that sort of stuff. And I'm in my 44th year of sobriety, and I'm 75 years old. And I've raised 4 kids and 8 grandkids, and self-supporting usually by my own contributions. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Step 12 and other stuff, So about 2 years ago, I've been honored to be asked over the years to speak at different venues, like on the circuit and everything, anywhere from Bali, Indonesia to wherever, different places all over the place. And about 2 years ago, I was asked to speak somewhere, and I always say, okay, so what's the format? Where do I show up? What's the format? What do I do? And they wrote me an email, and they said, it's ESH. Now you guys probably know what ESH is, but when I saw this, which was I guess I had about 41 years when I saw this ESH. I didn't know what that was. I don't know how I escaped that, and then I figured out it was experience, strength, and hope. Did you guys know that? You didn't know that? I don't feel so stupid now. I figured, man, I'll bet everybody knows that except for me. I have to put out an ESH, experience. Everything experience, they said ESH. So I experience, strength, and hope. And then I have this idea, which could be wrong. This is my experience. So that's what I'm just going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about my experience. I have this idea that there's a possibility that people don't really want to hear my experience. I know we say we want to hear the experience, strength, and hope. There's a possibility that my experience makes people uncomfortable. I try to share my experience because the big book says we never apologize for God. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. Instead, we let him demonstrate through our story as to what God has done for us. It says, at once, through our testimony, what he's done for us, at once we begin to outgrow fear. And I guess that's experience, strength, and hope. I know the big book says what I'm supposed to do is each alcoholic in his own language and from his own point of view talks about how he develops his relationship with God. And I think that's part of experience, strength, and hope. But I'm not sure everybody I'm not sure when they say they want to hear my experience, strength, and hope, they really want to hear my experience. Maybe I think sometimes that some people would rather hear my like some sort of homogenized, pasteurized, sterilized experience that doesn't make anybody uncomfortable. And I want to try to explain that to you in a way of explaining the 12th step. And I'm thinking maybe the best way to explain the 12th step is by giving you some vignettes as to things that actually happened to me over the last 44 years that have to do with the 12th step. And then maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. Before I do that, so at least you get something out of this that's actually AA approved. Because God forbid we do anything that's not AA conference approved. I don't have a huge respect for the conference. Now, I want to let you know, I'm not saying they did anything wrong, and I love them. Bill Wilson had 21 years. I think it was right before or after he was taking the LSD, and everybody else had less than that. And they did a lot of good things. I don't have anything against traditions of the conference or anything like that. It's just that I've never felt myself, for the last 20 years, I've never felt myself constrained by what other groups or things or whatever it is. I just, say what I think the Lord puts on my heart. And that's the way I do it, So, but maybe you'll understand. But I can tell you one thing. What you'll get from me tonight, you'll get my experience. Whether you like it, whether you don't like it, whether it's conference approved or not conference approved, whether it violates every tradition of the book or it doesn't, you'll get my experience. And then what you can do is you can go off and have your own experiences, and maybe by the time you reach 44 years or 50 years or 30 years, you might find that your experience maybe comports with my experience. Because one of the things that I realized is that how you read the big book and what you see in the big book, how you digest the big book and the 12 and 12 and the Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. As you read each book and you go along with years and years and years, and you experience life and the problems of life, and you start developing a faith, like they talk about in chapter Agnostics, that is not only a faith that allows you to stop drinking, but a faith that developing a faith in God that allows you to live, and then ultimately involves allowing you to live and experience the joy of living, not just just one day at a time. I'm hanging in there, but the joy of living. To go from a man, I came in when I was 31 years old, who sought validity in his life from the car I drove, or validity in my life from the amount of money I had, or validity in life from vanity stuff like how much I weighed, or when I was buff, or to seek validity for being alive and okay in the eyes of a woman, or in the eyes of men, or in the life of any other creature on the planet Earth. To go from that situation to try to wrest some sort of reason for being able to be alive based upon things and people and what they thought about me and everything like that, to a time in my life where I feel like I'm being poured out like a drink offering, which is, if you want to know what that is, you'll have to Google it. Be poured out like a drink offering. And just basing your life on the love of God and trying to help other people is a whole different type of thing. How you get to that place is through a lot of experiences. And one of the things that I recognize is that and I'm just going to use, I'm generalizing. Every year that goes by in AA that I read the big book, or the 12 and 12, or Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, and sometimes these other books, you don't even start getting into them until you got 10 or 15, 20 years. Every experience I have, everything I overcome, every trial I go through, every humiliation and the crushing of my self-sufficiency, the cancer, the IRS, the being broke, the raising children, the going to meet, everything I've been through, every year, I open this up, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm reading a different book. Now, I don't think the book changes. I'm thinking the book doesn't change. I think my perspective changes. The way I see the book. Like one year I open it up, and I don't see anything in the book that says anything good about religion. I mean, I'm spiritual, not religious. Then I open up the book and I see all of a sudden I start seeing we lose all prejudice, even against organized religions. We begin to see when they're right. And then I open up the book and it says we encourage church membership. And I open up the book and I see that a well-loved clergyman says that the men who have been separated out and the women are those who are trying to grow in the image and likeness of their Creator. And every day, every time I look at the book, I'm looking like at a different book. But the book hasn't changed, but somehow I've changed. because of the things I'm doing. My experience, so at 10 years sobriety, I'm reading one thing, and I'm hearing one thing, and at 20 years sobriety, I'm hearing another thing, and at 30 years sobriety, I'm hearing another thing. I mean, things happen in your life that completely turn you around. And so I have a certain amount of experience at 5 years and things that happen to me, and I have experience like at 10 years and things that happen to me, and I have experience at 20 years, and from 20 years to 40 years, my experience has made a complete change in me. So there are some people in here that have 5 years. And if I ask them, I'm just saying, I'm using 5 as just as something I picked out of the year. It could be 7, 5 years, let's say. And if I ask them, describe the changes that have happened in your mind between one day and 5 years, they wouldn't be able to cover it all. They wouldn't even know where to start. You know what I mean? I want to know every change in your thinking between one day and 5 years. All they'd be able to say is a lot. They give me 3 or 4 or 5 things, and as they would drive away in the car, they'd start thinking about 200 other things. So then if I said, well, give me the changes in your thinking about yourself and other people between 5 years and 15 years, and they wouldn't be able to do it. They would just say it would be a lot. How about between 15 years and 25 years? And they would be a lot. So I don't know whether I can explain the changes in my life between like one day and 44 years. You understand what I'm saying? But I think I can give you an idea. There's a possibility I might be able to give you an idea of what's happened to me. But that means I got to give you my experience with this disease and recovery over the last 43 years and 9 or 10 months. You understand what I'm saying? I got to try to figure out how to do that. So that's an awesome task, I think. I don't know whether I'll be able to do it well, but I'm going to do the best I can. But first I want to read you 2 things. And these things I'm going to read you, I didn't even see until I had maybe 15 or 20 years. This is in, quote, conference-approved material, lest you think that I'm using illegal shit. You know what I mean? So this is conference-approved material, but this is AA and how they did it. You know that thing, rarely ever seen a person fail? It was thoroughly. Repeat the word thoroughly. Followed our path. That was written in 1939. This was their path. Let me read you just 2 snippets I could do of what AA was in 1935, 36, 37, 38, and 39. This is on page 101 of Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. On the other hand, we were taking them upstairs and getting them on their knees to surrender. We were taking them upstairs and getting them on their knees to surrender, which I felt was a very important part of the program. The surrender was more than important, it was a must. Bobby, who came into AA in February of 1937, recalled that after 5 or 6 days in the hospital, this is right out of the hospital, when you had indicated that you were serious, they told you to get down on your knees by the hospital bed and say a prayer to God, admitting that you were powerless over alcohol and that your life was unmanageable. Furthermore, you had to state that you believed in a higher power who would restore you to sanity. And that's what you did at the hospital before you went to your first meeting. There you can see the beginning of the 12 steps. He said, we called that the surrender. They had a name for it. They called it the surrender. None of you guys had to go through that. None of you guys had to do that. There's a bunch of guys in the back there that said, well, if they had asked me to do that, I wouldn't have been here. And that's right, you wouldn't have been here. You wouldn't have been allowed in the meeting. Some of you might have crawled back and said, I think I changed my mind. You know what I mean? It would have been a different type of meeting. There you can see the beginning of the 12 steps. He called that surrender. They demanded it. You could not go to an AA meeting until you did it. If by accident you didn't make it in the hospital, you had to make it in the upstairs bedroom over the Williamsons' house right before their meeting. Despite Dorothy S.M. recalled the 1937 meetings when the men would all disappear upstairs and all of us women would be nervous and worried about what was going on. After about half an hour or so, down would come the new man, shaking, white, serious, and grim. And all the people who were already, I don't see that too much at AA meetings. Do you see people walking out of here shaking, white, serious, and grim? They're laughing, they're smoking in the parking lot, they're saying, man, that was a good meeting, I like that guy, and everything like that. Well, back then, after about a half an hour or so, down would come the new man, shaking, white, serious, and grim. And all the people who were already in AA would come trooping down after him. They were pretty reluctant to talk about what had happened, but after a while, they would tell us that they had a real surrender. I often wonder how many people that come in now would survive an experience like that. A regular old-fashioned prayer meeting, said Dorothy, who was then married to AA member Clarence S. That was the fellowship of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. When in context, when you read the big book, it says, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. This was their path. This is what they did. That's how they did AA. I call that the fellowship of the founders. It's also the fellowship of the Spirit. You didn't get into AA until you'd already done the third step. There were no guys chuckling in the back of the room. There was nobody saying, I wouldn't have been here if you forced me to do that, because the only people that got in were the people that were willing to do that, because that's the only people that they judged to be serious. It was drastic. Here's the next thing. This is on page 143 of Dr. Bob, Good Old Timers. This is Clarence S. Remember, his wife talked about that. This is Clarence S. And how Dr. Bob, 12-step Clarence S. Dr. Bob was the gentleman who said to Bill Wilson, let's not screw this thing up, let's keep it simple. Dr. Bob's the one who said, what is first things first? And he said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things will be added unto you. Dr. Bob was the one who, if you asked him, what's this AA thing all about? He said, what does it say in the Bible? Dr. Bob is the one who said the books we found absolutely essential to read is 1 Corinthians 13, Sermon on the Mount, and the book of James. So this is how Dr. Bob 12-stepped you. If you were in the hospital or something like that. And you met Dr. Bob, and he was going to talk to you about coming to the program. This is how Dr. Bob did it. Doc Smith came in. This is how he 12-stepped Clarence. Doc Smith came in later and took over. He sat on the edge of my bed and said, now you got pictures, this is in the hospital. This is Clarence, he's in the hospital. Dr. Bob comes in, sits on the bed and says, well, what do you think of all this? Then he paused and looked at me doubtfully. And Bob looks at him and says, I don't think you're ready yet. Guy's in the hospital. You're kind of young. And this is what Clarence says. I was down to 135 pounds. I've never seen 135 pounds. I can tell you that. I don't know what that is. Is anybody here 135 pounds? Any men, I was down to 135 pounds. I had no job, no clothes, and no money. I didn't know how much more ready I could be, recalls Clarence. Still, now listen to this, I had to convince them that I was ready. I had to convince them that I was ready. Now, we run around trying to convince other people that they're ready. We say, no, wait a second, listen, there's more, don't worry about the God, don't worry about this. We had to convince them that they're ready. They had to convince, I had to convince them I was ready. Then Dr. Bob asked, this is the first question Dr. Bob asked. First question, do you believe in God, young fella? First question. I know in this organization right now, they say don't talk about the God thing, you're killing newcomers. Back then, they tried to kill you right off the bat. Slaughter that fucker, you know what I mean? Kill that son of a bitch. He might come in and infect the rest of these guys, and they won't have any faith. Let's just get the cream of the crop. The sickest, craziest, most desperate alcoholic that we can find. Because they're not going to say things like, yes, but you don't understand, I'm different, you know, I've got a girlfriend, let's get the sickest son of a bitch. Then he asked, do you believe in God, young fella? He always called me young fella. When he called me Clarence, I knew I was in trouble. So he says, this is what Clarence says, well, what does that have to do with it? Dr. Bob says, everything. Doesn't want you to get totally mixed up about what you're getting into. Well, I guess I do. Dr. Bob says, guess nothing. You either do or you don't. So he says, yes, I do. He says, that's fine, Dr. Bob replied. Now we're getting someplace. All right, get out of bed and on your knees. We're going to pray. I don't know how to pray. Well, I guess you don't. But that's all right. Just follow what I say, and that will do for now.
Daya's kid.
God bless her. No, little kids need sober mommies. It says, I don't know how to pray. I guess you don't, but that's all right. Just follow what I say, and that will do for now. I love this line. I did what I was ordered to do. There were no suggestions. Dr. Bob was always positive about his faith. Clarence said if somebody asked him a question about the program, his usual response was, what does it say in the Bible? Suppose he was asked, what's all this first things first thing about? Dr. Bob would be ready with an appropriate quotation, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things will be added unto you. So, because of my experience in AA, I'm a Dr. Bob Alkie. I'm a Dr. Bob. I'm not a Bill Wilson Alkie. I'm a Dr. Bob Alkie. I'm not a Fellowship of the Problem Alkie. I'm not a don't drink, go to meetings Alkie. Doesn't mean you can, or there's anything wrong with that, because I started out that way. But I can tell you right now, I'm a Dr. Bob Alkie. I'm a member of the Fellowship of the Spirit. To me, my Alcoholics Anonymous is the Fellowship of the Founders. Doesn't have to be yours. You can do whatever you want. You understand what I'm saying? That's just my deal. Okay? So you know at least there's one person exists. I'm not the only one. I am not the only one who believes this. Okay? Now, let me tell you the story as to how I got here. Because I didn't get here like the first day or even after 10 years. So I'm in the hospital. First of all, it's December 25th, 1980. And I think my life is over. I've been divorced from my first wife, lost my wife, lost my child. I mean, I gave them away. I flushed them down the toilet so I could cat around and go out with other women and do all that stuff. And I finally, my first wife divorced me, and I heard a lot of people. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning on Christmas morning, and I thought my life was over. It was never getting better again. I was in my bachelor pad. My goal in life was to be the Hugh Hefner of Miami, which is hard to do when you can't even stand up without wobbling. And I knew my life was over. It was never to get better again. Some preacher came on TV. He said, if you want to change your life, accept Jesus into your life. And like a shot, I got down on my knees. I said the sinner's prayer. I accepted the Lord into my life, which is not a big deal for a lot of people, but I was a Jewish kid from New York, so believe me, it was a big deal. But it sort of gives you an idea of how desperate I was. You know what I mean? That's how desperate. I was about as desperate, I suppose, as Clarence. You know what I mean? You get down, I was ready, and I came down on my knees. But in any event, to make a long story short, I continued to drink. And then 30 days later, I used to think nothing happened, but something really did happen. And sometimes God works some stuff in your life, you do some stuff, and you don't really see the results until later on. And 30 days later, January 25th, 1981, I had my last drink, at least up till now, my last drink. But I'm in the hospital, and a guy comes to see me, in the hospital. His name's Bob Sullivan, turned out to be my last sponsor, and I was all set to tell him he had the wrong, because I was now feeling a little bit better, and I was also to tell him he had the wrong guy. He had the wrong guy, you know what I mean? That I know from where you're standing, you think I have a drinking problem, but I don't really have a drinking problem. I drink because I have problems, and as a matter of fact, my drinking perfectly matches my problems, and pretty soon my problems are going to go away, and I won't have to drink so much. So thank you very much for your help, but why don't you go screw yourself, or something like that. If you wanted to come to me about my drinking, but he threw me a curve. He didn't talk to me about me, talk to me about himself. He knew how to make it 12. He talked about his situation, and I started identifying with him. And he said, Russ, you never have to drink anymore if you don't want to, which I had never heard before. I had people say, why do you drink the way you drink? But nobody told me you don't have to if you don't want to, because I thought I had a drink. And he says, you never have to feel the way you feel right now if you don't want to. I never wanted to feel the way I felt. And so I followed him a day, and I picked up my white chip, okay? And he was the kind of guy back then, which is like 45 years ago, half a century ago. Back then, there would be wet drunks in the room. We would go out and we would go out and get people and grab them and bring them in and do this sort of stuff. We're working for guys, and we were trying to help other people who were drinking, who couldn't stop drinking, and that's what I was brought up on. And I got a ton of stories about doing that, going out and bringing a guy someplace and bringing a guy here and there, and I did all that. And I was 8 years on relay. In Dade County, there was a thing called relay, where you could volunteer that if anybody called up AA, they got you first. And my time was every Friday between 8 o'clock at night and 9 o'clock Saturday morning. If anybody called Alcoholics Anonymous, they got me. So nobody stayed sober during that 8-year period of time, you know what I mean? But I had a lot of experiences that I could tell you about people calling up. And I sponsored, because back then we sponsored people. You had to sponsor people. And I sponsored people, and I still sponsor people. And I sponsored people. And the whole thing was not drink, go to meetings. Don't drink even if the ass falls off. The kind of meetings you go to today, there's nothing wrong. That's what my whole life was about. Just don't drink and go to meetings and do the steps and learn how to do the 4th step and the 5th step and this step and that and all the steps, and I became proficient in doing the steps. I bought into everything in AA. I bought into everything. You understand? Everything I bought into. And I want to tell you all sorts of 12-step stories. I got a ton of them, and they're fun, and we'd all laugh about them. But the problem is I want to get to the best part, the most important part. And doing all that, doing everything in AA, sponsoring 5, 10, 15, 100, 2, 3, whatever it was, a lot of people, speaking all over the place, doing the steps, teaching the steps, this sort of stuff, this step stuff. I've been doing this for like 35 years, here and other places, and I'm going to start another one in 2 or 3 weeks, and then another one at the 12th. I've been doing it for a long time, that kind of stuff. And doing AA, doing the mechanics of AA, doing the 4, teaching it, reading the books, and doing all that. And all that got me to the point where I was sober, and I would do these things, and I'd sponsor a lot of people, and it was all good, and sometimes I'd experience the promises, and sometimes I'd want to kill myself, and sometimes I was floating on air, and sometimes I was 3 o'clock in the morning sucking my thumb, and and work, because I was picking up medallions, 5-year medallion, 6-year medallion, 10-year medallion. And then at 10 years, something happened. I don't know what happened. It stopped working. I didn't drink, but it stopped working. I don't know how to explain to you what it's like unless you've been through it, the second bottom in AA, where you solve the drink problem. You're not drinking, but all of a sudden the think problem catches up to you. And you can no longer run that treadmill like a hamster on a treadmill, doing the 4th step, doing the 5th step, intensive work with alcoholics, running here, running there. And you find that no matter how hard you work and how many 4th steps you do and whatever it is, what it does is it just gets you over the hump of feeling of not drinking one day, not drinking, and then the next day you're running the race. You got running the 4-minute mile every single day, one day at a time. And you know something? You may do it perfectly for 10 years, but all alcoholism needs is one time when the problems get so great, and all of a sudden they add one more problem, the straw that breaks the camel's back, or maybe a good thing, all of a sudden you come to a lot of money, and then all of a sudden you're drinking again. Or you're suicide. I mean, you got to do this thing perfectly just to stay sober every day. Then know the stuff. And all alcoholism needs is one night, one day, Just one more thing, maybe cancer, maybe IRS seized your account, maybe 3 things happen at the same time, and all of a sudden you're gone. And one day you wake up and you're not talking to anybody, you don't talk to your group about this because they think you got 10 years and you're wonderful, and you're sponsoring all these people. And you don't see other people with 10, 20, 30 years talking about this in AA. And you go to your meetings, you know what you hear at your meetings? You see, don't drink and go to meetings. Don't drink even if your ass falls off. And you're not drinking, but you're miserable. And I don't know how to explain that to you, but one day if any of you guys go through that, you understand what I'm saying? You'll say, this must be what Russell was talking about. And all you hear is the reason why people drink is because they stop going to meetings. And maybe that is true. Maybe that's one of the reasons. But you see a lot of people drink or commit suicide or do stuff who are going to meetings. They're going to meetings and say, well, what happened? Or they're miserable about their sobriety. So I go up to a guy and he says, you know something? You need to start really going to Bible study. And I explained to him, because I've been totally indoctrinated by AA the way it is today. Not Founders AA, AA the way it is today, that Bible and religion is bad. Jesus is bad. Priests are bad. Ministers are bad. All religion is bad. What we become spiritual. And anybody who's hung around alcoholics or is an alcoholic themselves who actually thinks that they're spiritual is fucking delusional. You're fucking delusional. And one day you're going to find out how delusional you are. If you think that you've somehow risen above the crowd, you're even more spiritual than church people. You're really spiritual because you've grown into an incredibly spiritual person until the money runs out or the cancer comes or something happens and you're all alone with your spirit. You'll find out a little bit about this disease, And the bottom line is, so this guy said, why don't you start going to Bible study? And I said, no, you don't understand. I'm spiritual, not religious, all this stuff. But a week later, I wound up in Bible study. And I met a guy who had 55 years sobriety. And he was a pastor. And he became my third sponsor. And all they were doing, and there was only one difference between Bible study and the Bible studies I went to in the church I joined and everything, because they say in the book, then all of a sudden I started seeing the thing in the books like, we encourage church membership. Most of us joined us organizations. I saw that in the big book, but they didn't say that in AA. They didn't say in the Fellowship of the Wellness, you know what I mean? This ain't Well People's Anonymous. And I met these guys and I was going there. The only difference between the stuff they were talking about in Bible study and the stuff they were talking about in AA, same stuff, same sins, same defects of character, same relying upon God, same stuff, is that in the Bible study, what they were focusing on is your relationship with God. And God wasn't a dirty word. And in AA, all they were talking about was the disease. The disease. And the drinking. And the not drinking. But in the Bible study, they were talking about the solution. They were talking about the solution. They were talking about Dr. Bob's solution. They were talking about Dr. Bob's solution. Do you believe in God? Because you see, what I found out later on over the years is that when you have a make-believe God, eventually you'll have make-believe sobriety. And so they warped me. I stayed too long and they warped me. Now let me tell you what happened. Here's the problem. Let me tell you about my experience in the last 20 years. This is my experience, let's say from 30 to 44, so you'll understand why I've changed a little bit, besides all the things that happened to you. So in the last, since I was maybe 30 years sober, 25 to 40 years sober, 45 years, what is that, over 20, it's a period of 20 years. Although I love newcomers and I'll talk newcomers and I'll help newcomers and everything like that, I have a heart for people that have 11 years, 15 years, 25 years, that aren't happy with their sobriety. I know they exist because in the big book it says here and there once in a while, an alcoholic, a former drinker says feel better, look better, having better time. We laugh at such Sally. We know he'll try the old game again because he's not happy with sobriety. Sooner he knows loneliness as few do. I mean, can you imagine how horrible it is to be, it's one thing to be horrible to be horrible in drinking and want to stop drinking. Imagine how horrible it is when you've stopped drinking for 20 years and you're in AA for 20 years and you're as lonely and as sad and as despondent as you were when you were drinking, and you're not drinking and you go into AA, and now you have no solution. You have no solution because you've done everything, you're doing the 4 steps, you're doing everything, and you get to a point where you hit a second bottom. And so what I get guys with 30 years who are suicidal and going to meetings. I get guys with 20 years who are despondent and going to meetings. I get guys that have 15 years, 25 years, 29 years, I get guys with time that are going to meetings. These aren't guys who stop going to meetings. I mean, every once in a while you get a guy and you can talk to him, you say, look, you just have to do a 4-step, you gotta do this. But once in a while you get people that have done all the steps and they're sponsoring people to do anything, and they are not experiencing the joy of living. They are not being rocketed into the 4th dimension of existence, experience much of heaven, and knowing peace. Because in order to do that, you see, you've got to do the great fact. And the great fact is this, and nothing less than, not even anything less than this, that God has to become the central fact of your life. And you must be absolutely convinced without doubt that he lives in your heart and mind in a way which is indeed miraculous. And that's not just some sort of shit I made up. That's in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because the guys that were really being rocketed, the guys back in the Fellowship of the Founders, that's what they were doing. They were like Dr. Bob guys. They were the guys that came into you and said, do you believe in God? What does that have to do with it? Everything. Get down on your knees. Those were those guys. They were the ones who were being rocketed. And, if you, Sandy Beach, if any of you listen to Sandy Beach, wonderful, wonderful circuit speaker, he said, and Chuck Chamberlain, every problem we have has to do with separation from God, and every solution we have in AA is connection with God. And no matter what they tell you, no matter what feeling you get sitting in a group of Alcoholics Anonymous, even if you're sober, okay, it's a tendency to think, well, you'll stay sober as long as you can do a good 4-step, or as long as you do a good 5th step, or whatever the 11th step is to you, even though God is. But the bottom line is, unless you figure out a way so that you start looking for validation in the eyes of a woman or a man or a car or money, this world, the worldly clouds of this world will blot out any sunshine of the Spirit and the presence of God, and you will go out and you will either drink again or not be able to overcome alcoholism. And you know what that is? That's the big book that's the real big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. So you start seeing these people, like I had 10 years, and they're asking me for help. They go to me for help, because you know why they come to me for help? I don't know why they come to me, except if you got 20 years, you're usually looking for help with somebody who's got 30 years or 40 years, you know what I mean? You don't find too many guys with 20 or 30 years going to guys with 5 years. They just naturally, I guess because of pride, and I got plenty of it, you know what I mean? So you go to somebody, and the bottom line is, when you start seeing these men come to you who are in AA and doing AA, and they're not happy with their sobriety, and I'm looking at them, and I remember the way I was 10 years, and you know what I talked about? I talked about God. Because the one thing I realized is they don't have the special ingredient. They're just missing one thing, the special ingredient. The central fact of their life. My sponsor, the guy with 55 years, we'd go to a Denny's, start eating, and he'd say, what are you doing? I said, I'm eating. He says, we gotta, listen, you gotta give thanks to the Lord first before you eat. And it wasn't an AA room where you could hold hands and nobody's there to watch you, or anything like that. It wasn't God wasn't a punchline. There were other people in the room that weren't praying, and I had to sit there with my sponsor and hold his hand while he said some long Baptist prayer, thanking everybody in the room and praying for everybody, and I'd be looking around worrying about what other people think about me, because that's what I'm really about. I'm really about, what do you think about me? And when your life is about what will they think about me, you're living a shitty life. You'll never be free. You'll never experience that promise, fear of people and economic insecurity. You'll never get over fear of people. You'll never get over fear of people. And that's the worst thing, to live and die and always be scared of what people might think about you, is the worst life in the world. The reason I can talk about this, you guys know. You never hear anybody in AA talk like this. Because they can't. Because they're scared of what you're going to think about them. That's shitty sobriety. I'd say it to the face, you got crappy sobriety. You're not free. You're still in bondage. So my sponsor would say to me after we're done saying the prayer, he'd look at me and says, now Russ, the food will taste better. Because it's got this special ingredient. That's how fucking corny this guy was. You know what I mean? You got to buy into this. You know what? You'd be surprised what happens to somebody. I know some of these people on Zoom. I know some of them have been through this. When somebody has 35 years and they know all about AA and they're sponsoring 10 million people and they're depressed and they're anxious and all of a sudden they start linking up with God and making God the central factor of their life. It doesn't take them 10 years. It doesn't take them 5 years. A week. Once the special ingredient is in their life, they go rocketed into the fourth dimension of existence. Now, when you see that happen, because the people I deal with are people that have 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. When you see people all of a sudden focus on the God thing, they know all the other stuff, and go rocket in the fourth dimension of existence and get excited and say, this is unbelievable. You know, I see it before my eyes. So you got to understand, this is my experience. My experience is working with people with time that know all about the stuff you're learning about in the steps. But now they're focused on that thing that they were told not to focus on because it's killing newcomers. You understand what I'm saying? And when they focus on that deal, their whole life changes. And they experience something called the joy of living. So what I'm trying to say to you is this. The truth of the matter is, I know we say we want people's experience, strength, and hope. But sometimes in AA, when they say they want your experience, strength, and hope, they want you to tell what it was like when you were drinking, what happened, and what it was like a year or 2 or 5 after you stopped drinking. But they don't want you to hear about what happened to you between 20 and 40 years sobriety. They don't want to hear about that stuff because that's when you get into the real deal. That's when you get into the 6-step stuff. That's when you get into growing in the image and likeness. That's when you get into the stuff that scares people. You know, you understand what I'm saying? So the truth of the matter is if I'm going to tell you about, and I also want to say this. I started out with the fellowship the way it is right now. And somehow I wound up in a different sort of fellowship. You understand? A different deal. I don't think it's a different deal. Somebody says, well, you're not really in AA anymore. Somebody says, well, you're not really in AA anymore. A friend of mine says, you're not in AA anymore. I said, no. I'm in AA. I'm just not in your AA. I'm in a different AA. You know what I mean? I know what AA I'm in. And the reason point that sometimes, at some point in time, if there's anybody here, I just want you all to know, my story is, there is something else. Whatever you're experiencing, if you ever get to a point where you feel stuck or you've hit a dead end, okay, there is another fellowship. It's called the Fellowship of the Spirit, where people aren't scared to talk about this stuff. I can tell you this, there's a ton of meetings on AA, but those people come from all over the world. All over the world. They're on there right now. There's a few on there right now. Every state in the union, they come there, not because it's geographically convenient, because they want to hear what the people are talking about, and they're not talking about not drinking. And these people have 10, 20, 30, and 40 years, and 45 years, and they go to that fellowship, because they're not worried about the drinking thing. They're worried about, not making God the central fact of their life. And you will become who you hang out with. So I want you to know that there's another fellowship in AA and also outside of AA, Fellowship of the Spirit, that talks about the stuff that Dr. Bob was talking about. So thank you very much.